Ladies and gentlemen, this Game video, we're going to be tackling some rumours that the Xbox Scorpio has had its GPU performance increased from 6 TFLOPS all the way up to 8 TFLOPS. Now, I originally wasn't going to cover these rumours, but quite a few people have messaged me concerning them, so I figured it's a good opportunity for me to just, tackle it in video form rather than keep messaging people individually. So, to get everyone onto the same page, although I imagine most of you are aware of the basics, but it's good just to make sure everyone's, on the same page. The Xbox Scorpio has been confirmed by Microsoft to be 6 TFLOPS, and we know it's got 320 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, and we can also make some presumptions on the rest of the system specifications based upon the images of the PCB that of course have been flooding the internet for some time now, and we can make some guesses that it's got 12 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory, and we don't know the CPU. That's one thing we're unsure of. All we know is it's an 8-core. However, 8 cores of what, in other words the architecture, we can presume it's still going to be x86 based, and most folks would agree it's probably a derivative of Jaguar. So it's probably not going to be, let's say, Zen. It's probably going to be either Jaguar or Puma, which is basically a small increase in performance over Jaguar. So the rumour has it that the Scorpio has been increased from 6 TFLOPS all the way up to 8, and this is a counter move, supposedly, against Sony. Now, another set of rumours, and these actually have some substantial names behind them, including some ex-Sony developers who have lent their voice behind the Sony rumours, that the PS4 Neo is going to have an increase in spec. Now, it's not necessarily they've confirmed the PS4K as having a spec bump, rather they're confirming that Sony are considering it, based upon what developers have asked them. Now, we don't know whether it's a GPU increase. Sony have instead been asked specifically regarding the memory. Now, what Sony will actually do, whether it's going to happen, whether there will be any increase, and if so, whether it's substantial. For example, it may just be system reserve reduction, so rather than the 5.5 gigabytes, it goes to like 6. We don't know, so all we can do is, guess. But anyway, now that I've laid the foundation for the rumour, that we can talk about it. So, the rumour has it, and as I said, it's from 6 to 8 TFLOPS. And I don't want to mention the channel's name because I don't like to be that person, but it's not particularly difficult to do some Googling if you really want to. But I have issues with the rumour for a couple of reasons. One, the individual in question did not mention a source. And for two, I wonder if it would be a case of like, well, how expensive is the system going to be at this point? For example, if you were to have a configuration of 56 compute units, and you were to times that by 64, remember, there's 64 shaders per compute unit, you times that by 2, and you times that by 850, you get roughly 6 TFLOPS. If, on the other hand, you were to take the same configuration, so once again 56 compute units, times it by 64, times by 2, and you were to go to like 1100 megahertz, you're still slightly shy of the 8 TFLOPS which are required. Now, the reason this is really important, as regular viewers will know, is quite simple. It's down to yields. So basically, when you're designing any system, and this comes down to the PlayStation 4, whether you're designing a PC GPU, whether you're designing any console, or even a handheld device, you have to rely on concerns such as power consumption, which isn't such a big deal in a high-spec PC because, well, there's dozens of different ways to extract the power, to extract the heat required. You could just go with a huge heatsink and fan assembly, you could use water cooling, you could have multiple fans in there. You can tell people, hey, you know what, you're going to have to rely on some pretty exotic cooling methodologies if you really wanted to, and this is particularly true for people doing overclocking. But generally speaking, those are the different things you've got to factor in. With a console, you can't do that because you're in a smaller form factor. The other concern you've got, rather than heat output, is also power consumption. So basically, the more power you drain from the device, A, it produces loads of heat, and B, well, it's not particularly good to have something that requires a nuclear reactor to be able to power it. So all of those factors, plus multiple other ones, for example, yields. Now, yields is very simple. How many out of X amount of chips that you produce will meet the muster? In other words, will not fail. So, and I always use this example. Let's say you have 100 chips you're producing, and let's say that you have, let's make it really simple, let's say that it's one processor core, just one processor core, and let's say that you're trying to get that to run at 1000 megahertz. So we're going back into the time machine, going way back into like the early Pentium 3, or sorry, late Pentium 3, early kind of 2000-ish era. And you wanted to hit one core running at 1000 megahertz. Out of every 100, you might have, I'm just making up a figure, let's say 2 in every 100 may be unable to reach those speeds. But if you try to increase that clock speed even more, let's do to 1100 megahertz, it may be that you can only get, let's say, 5 of every 100 will be incapable of reaching those speeds, which leads to speed binning. So basically, if you're producing chips for high-end devices, for example, let's say the GTX 1080, it may be some of the chips that go down to the GTX 1070 basically are, they have some of the shaders, some of the CUDA cores which just didn't work when they're actually originally producing them. So, for example, it could be some of the SMs, some of the shader, some of the streaming multiprocessors actually physically do not work on that board. So even if you were to somehow be able to go in there and modify the BIOS, which you can't, but let's just assume you could, there's a good possibility that they just would not work initially because they're physically incapable of running, they're damaged. So with consoles, it's not like that. You can't have one Xbox Scorpio with like 56 compute units and another one with like 53, just for example. So what you need to do is Sony need to ensure, or Microsoft need to ensure, or Nintendo need to ensure that all of those chips reach that specific criteria. Now, you may think to yourself, what the hell does that have to do with anything? Well, what I'm basically saying is that it's going to be at a bit of a tall order in 2017 for them to do that. Bear in mind, at this point, the highest part we know that, and I'm going with single chip here, so this is not multiple GPU configurations, a single chip, and bear in mind from the image we saw of Scorpio, we only saw a single chip, and let's face it, the cooling in the device looked pretty anemic, so unless they're going to redesign a lot of the PCB and the cooling system, there's a good chance that that's pretty much what we're going to be getting, or they were using it for illustrative purposes. So my point being that the actual highest part that we know of is Vega 10, which has, from leaks, these are not random leaks, this is from someone's LinkedIn profile, where they actually specifically said that they designed a 64 compute unit module with Vega 10. So we can make a good assumption that that's probably going to be the highest part. Now, whether we're going to see higher configurations in the future, we don't know, and there's a good possibility that we might, especially with multi chips being part of AMD's and Nvidia's development history. For example, we can look at the Fury Duo, which was basically 2 Fury GPUs strapped onto the same PCB. And this has happened multiple times over. Actually, no, it's Radeon Pro Duo to be more accurate with the naming convention, but still. So if you want a too long didn't read, could Microsoft do it? Yeah, they could. They could definitely increase the GPU performance. I don't think it will be to 8 TFLOPS if they did. They could possibly put it to like 6.2, 6.4 quite comfortably. And bear in mind, even if they went as modest increase in the performance, it would still ruffle stomp the PS4 Neo, because unless Sony did a complete redesign of the GPU, a complete redesign of the SoC, and because they're aiming to release this year, it's very unlikely they're going to do this, and this is something I tackled like a day or so ago. they don't really have the time to do that. The best Sony can do at this point is increase the clock speed. But from what we understand of the Neo, it's running at 911 megahertz or 913. I think it's 913 actually, but who's splitting hairs over 2 megahertz? And that's putting out roughly 4.2 TFLOPS of performance. Even if they were to overclock the damn thing to ludicrous levels, let's say we were to run it at 1200 megahertz, it's still behind the Scorpio. Now, this isn't a Sony versus Microsoft thing, this is just hardware is hardware thing. And honestly, it depends on pricing. It's like, yeah, Microsoft could do this. I mean, honestly, Microsoft have the time, theoretically, if they really wanted to. And I'm not saying they will do this. This is not me starting a rumour. This is me just throwing out what they could theoretically do. They theoretically could get a GPU with 64 shaders. They could add that in. They could put in high bandwidth memory 2 of 8 gigabytes, and they could, in theory, put in a Zen processor that's got 16 threads available to it, with 16 gigabytes of, DDR4 memory, and they could do a total redesign. They could do that, absolutely, but how much money is it physically going to cost? And it's all down to cost, because they're not going to want to lose money on the device. At best, they want to sell it at a non-loss. So, in other words, they're not making profit on it. Bear in mind, the original Xbox cost them money. It was very expensive to produce. And the damn thing, the original Xbox was friggin' monstrous. I've said this multiple times. The original Xbox, it stomped the PS2. It stomped the GameCube in most tasks. And it actually was really high up there. The GPU was the equivalent of like I think it was a high-end GeForce 3. It was really powerful for the time, especially considering that the resolution it was targeting was often 640 by 480, non-progressive scan, and it did handle some games in 720p, but generally it was aimed at just SDTVs, which gave even more performance for other tasks. So yeah, that's my take on this. So you can take it however you want. Frankly, I'm looking forward to both systems, and I'm definitely going to buy both. I'm kind of looking forward to see what Neo actually has to offer, simply because it's going to be first. So because we get it first, we can make an assumption, or at least a guesstimate, of what the Scorpio is going to be like in terms of development. Personally, I kind of like what Microsoft are doing, because they've been a little less stringent from what I understand based upon leaks and interviews. Sony have basically said that they don't want games to run sub 1440p for the PS4K. In fact, they would like it higher. So the question you've got to ask yourself when it comes to the Neo is quite simple. If you own a 1080p television, are you going to really benefit from the Neo? Possibly, especially if you're a VR gamer. With the Scorpio, Microsoft have said, yep, you can do whatever the hell you want with this thing. You can use the performance however you would like, which I kind of like, but I'm not saying one's better than the other, because ultimately we do not have the hardware in our hands yet. But with all of that said, yeah. So, am I saying the rumours are inaccurate? No, because no one really knows what Sony, what Microsoft, what Nintendo, and God, don't even get me started on Nintendo. I mean, I even heard just yesterday that Nintendo actually lost the contract with Nvidia, and they're not doing the NX thing, but it was some random rumour on a forum, so I'm like, well, I'm not going to report that, because there was like no posting history really regarding the individual, and they just said it, off the cuff. So unless it's some established leaker in the industry and they've actually had a history and a lot of credence behind them, then I'm a little more dubious reporting it. But generally speaking, let's just wait and see on this one. So yeah. But either way, it's going to be a bloody good time to be a gamer, I think, for the next couple of years. And I guess the biggest question, actually not on the performance of the console, the biggest question is, will the market tolerate the consoles? And that, my friends, is an entire different story. Because really, it's going to be down to both Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo. Although Nintendo have less of a job because it's a new system. So you've got that okay, well, I can't play games, presumably, we don't know. But from what we understand, you can't play NX games on the Wii U, so they, if you want to play an NX exclusive, you need an NX. Whereas with the Xbox and the PlayStation ecosystems. If you've got a PS4 vanilla or you've got an original Xbox, then you're good. You can play any game you want. So it's really going to be for them to convince us, hey, you know, it'd be a really good idea for you to upgrade. If not, and they can't do that, it actually gives both companies a lot of sniping power. So, for example, if Sony can't convince you, yeah, you need to buy a PS4K, dude, then you've got loads of money, presumably, to spend, especially if you're not interested in the PS VR, which some people are not going to be. Some people might want to wait a couple of months and see if there's loads of shovelware on it, and some people might jump on it immediately. But let's say they don't, then you might wait and think, well, I'm going to wait and possibly buy a Scorpio or wait what happens. Or you might decide just to buy a high-end PC. And honestly, given what Microsoft are doing when it comes to Windows 10 and how they are putting the vast majority of games to PC, I would probably, if the system was at a very high price point, I would rather buy a PC. Because you can buy a really powerful GPU, a really powerful CPU. You can already buy, without too much difficulty, you can buy a Polaris-based GPU. You can buy a fairly cheap i5, and even if you want to go like an i7, you can buy a pretty cheap configuration and get a system that's much more powerful than PS4K right this second. Doesn't take much. I mean, you know, the Polaris 10 based RX 480 is already 6 TFLOPS. Slightly out. It's about 5.9. But you can get some custom models which are hitting 6. And that's if you're going with that. I mean, don't even get me started if you go with the GTX 1070, the GTX 1080, or even the GTX 1060. I mean, the 1070 alone is freaking ridiculous. I've basically finished with the review now. I'm just finishing off the audio. And it's fucking ridiculous. I mean, we're talking running Doom on a GTX 1070 at 4K, all settings at the absolute bloody maximum on Vulkan, and you're getting like 40 to 60 plus frames a second, non-overclocked. It's insane. It's just ludicrous. It's like, I don't even want to imagine what the GTX 1080 is like. I've not used one yet. And that's 25% faster, so don't even freaking get me started. But of course, then you're paying the price premium. But then, if the Scorpio is going to cost this amount of money, well, eh. Anyway, I'm getting way off topic here, so hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.